Honor Club, where honor is real.
What's up, wrestling fans? Welcome to episode 5 of Old School in Session. My name is Kevin Eck, and it is my pleasure to introduce the Ring of Honor Director of Operations and a former promoter and/or executive for WCW, the NWA's Georgia Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, and the AWA. He is the man who makes old school cool, Gary Juster. Gary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Thank you. And not to argue with your introduction, which is very flattering, but I don't know if I really make old school cool or not. Hopefully, I make it interesting to those who love that era. Whether it's cool or not, I don't know. But I think it's a lot of fun to reminisce about how things were in the kayfabe era, because it's just so different from the way things are now.
No question about that. And I would say this, to me, your stories are very cool. So that makes you the man who makes old school cool. And it's a good rhyme, and it's the best I can come up with.
All right, we'll let it go then.
Okay, all right. So Halloween is this week. So before we really get into this week's topic, I just was wondering, since you grew up a big wrestling fan, just like I did you ever dress up as a wrestler for Halloween?
I don't believe that I did.
Okay.
I know that around Halloween time, there were times, because there were scary creatures that were dressed up. But no matter how scary a costume might have been, the scariest thing to me back when I was growing up was the Crusher, who was a heel in Minneapolis. And I remember often having dreams that the Crusher was coming to invade my home when he was a heel. So that was ghoulish in a sense.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess if you wanted to dress up as Crusher, that'd be tough for a young man, because you'd have to have a cigar sticking out of your mouth, and I guess you couldn't really do anything else that would be very distinguishable unless you kind of got the Crusher. What did they call those haircuts back in the day? A wiffle? Isn't that what the Crusher had?
Yeah, or maybe a flat top.
Flat top, yeah. That'd be a tough one to pull off for a kid.
Probably it would have been.
So my story, when I was a kid, the Valiant brothers, Handsome Jimmy and Luscious Johnny, were very big. When I was 7 years old, Handsome Jimmy, Luscious Johnny, the Valiant brothers were my favorite wrestlers, especially Jimmy. And I decided I was going to be Jimmy Valiant for Halloween. This is like 1974. I didn't have a friend who wanted to be Johnny, so I was the Valiant brother. I didn't have a partner. So what I did was I had a pair of black pants, and the Valiants used to write stuff on the side of their pants, like, something simple, like, New York City, or I think one time Jimmy had U.S. Mail, M-A-L-E. Just little sayings like that. So I took some white chalk and wrote those sayings on my pants. My mom, remember, this is the 70s, had a pair of white go-go boots. And luckily, at 7 years old, my foot was a similar size to hers. So I put on the go-go boots, because the Valiants wore white boots. Got a blonde wig, because they had long blonde hair. Got some sunglasses, because, of course, they always did that. And I had a little, even back in those days, this is before the mass merchandising of replica belts, I had bought a little really, really cheap-looking championship belt that I had bought in like I guess we used to call it a 5 and dime type store. So I had the belt around my waist. So I had everything I needed. And, of course, it's October, and I'm ready to go out, because the Valiants didn't wear shirts. So, they wrestled bare-chested. So I'm ready to go out bare-chested. And it's October, and it's like, I don't know, 40 degrees or whatever it was. Mom was not having that. So she made me put on a coat, which ruined the whole thing. I said, Handsome Jimmy and Luscious Johnny, they don't wear jackets. It's going to ruin the whole thing. But anyway, wore the jacket. I don't know how many doors I knocked on that night. I could not find one person who knew who I was supposed to be. Wrestling was not as mainstream as it became. So no one got it, but it was fun for me. And then as an adult, of course I became, I think I did The Rock one year. Hulk Hogan is an easy one to do. I did the Hollywood Hogan, with the feathered boa and the black beard with the blonde goatee. But that's it for me. That's my Halloween experience. But yeah, Jimmy Valiant, it didn't go over very well in my neighborhood. I guess there were not a lot of pro wrestling fans where I grew up.
Well, he would have been easier to emulate in costume as the Boogie Woogie Man, probably, than as Handsome Jimmy.
Yes, and the funny thing is about that is, again, I loved Handsome Jimmy Valiant as a kid. Later, when he became the Boogie Woogie Man, nothing personal against him. I never met the guy, but I could not stand that character. He was one of my least favorite wrestlers when he did the Boogie Woogie Man. I mean, the matches.
As Jimmy Valiant, he was a more believable character. Yes. Boogie Woogie Man was more of a comedy character.
Total comedy. The matches were terrible. His finishing move was just an elbow drop. And but you booked him on some shows and you were around him. What was he like behind the curtain? I mean, that Boogie Woogie Man character was so over the top. What was he like when the camera was off?
He was quiet. He was not anything that's really stood out in the locker room. There was a story once. I had two friends come up to the matches in Baltimore, close friends. So I put them on the parking list if you recall, there was a garage at the Baltimore Civic Center.
Right.
And a bunch of fans would hover around there waiting for the wrestlers to come in. And when my friends, Pete and Joe, came in, as Pete tells the story, one of the fans jumped in and looked at them and looked at Pete and said, "He's no wrestler." And then looked at his wife, Shoshana, and said, "She's not Big Mama." And they proceeded to park in the garage, disappointing the fans that it was not the Boogie Woogie Man and Big Mama.
God, I almost forgot about Big Mama. Yes, now she was a character in and of herself. I remember. Yeah. Jimmy brought her in, and I know we're getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but I remember there was an angle with the Midnight Express, I believe, and Jimmy had his wife, I believe. Big Mama was his real life wife, I believe. And then he also had Ronnie Garvin in drag.
Yeah, Miss Atlanta Lively.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yep, the good old days.
All right, well, let's get on to what's going to be our main topic this week. And it actually stems from a question we got on Twitter using the hashtag AskGary. It comes from someone with the Twitter handle of Crown Us King and says, "Do you have any good Nick Bockwinkel stories?" And I'm guessing that you do, since, a couple weeks ago we talked about how the legendary former AWA champion Vern Gagne, geez, I almost said Greg Gagne. Vern Gagne played a significant role in giving you your first big break in the wrestling business. So I guess it's only fitting that we talk about another former legendary AWA champion, Nick Bockwinkel, because as you told it last week, he's the person who actually introduced you to Vern and actually was more of a mentor to you. So do you have any good Nick Bockwinkel stories?
Well, Nick came to the AWA in around 1970, I believe, 70 or 71. And that was the time when I started to hang out at the TV studio to kind of meet wrestlers if I could and pitch them on this idea that I had of doing an annual yearbook. So the first wrestler to really take a liking to me and to that idea was Nick Bockwinkel. And Nick, I recall when he first started, was this amazing performer in the ring and also carried himself as a professional athlete. Just kind of emulated class that often was not the case with other pro wrestlers. He spoke in a very eloquent, intelligent way. He started out, I guess, as what we'd call a tweener. He wasn't really a babyface or a heel, but he then gravitated toward being a heel to a large degree due to his interviews, where he would use large words. He had a great vocabulary, and he would speak oftentimes kind of over the head of the average fan. So that just irritated wrestling fans and got him heat that way. And then, of course, in the ring, he would start to behave as a heel. One of the things, I don't know that it's an interesting story, but I always thought it was interesting, was that Vern Gagne, who of course ran the territory and booked it, brought Bobby Heenan in to manage Nick and his then partner Ray Stevens. And what I thought was so curious about that was oftentimes managers were used when wrestlers were not good on the mic, so the manager could get them heat through interviews that the wrestler would not otherwise get. Nick, on the other hand, was perhaps the best speaker, the best talker in the game, at least in the AWA. Ray Stevens, his partner, was also good on the mic, and they were very different in their styles on the mic. So I always thought it was peculiar and rather curious that they paired them with another talker, with Bobby Heenan. It did work. The tag team was very successful, drew a lot of money, drew a lot of heat, but I just always thought it was strange that you would take the best talker in the territory and pair him up with another talker, with a manager.
Yeah, and that's funny you should say that, because I was going to ask you that same question of the Bobby Heenan pairing with Nick Bockwinkel for that very reason. There was a similar situation in the WWF back in the day with superstar Billy Graham and the Grand Wizard of Wrestling back during Superstars run. And he's talked about it in shoot interviews that he told Vincent J. McMahon, I don't need a mouthpiece. But the formula back then was you had the three heel managers of the Wizard, Lou Albano, and Fred Blassie, and they would bring in it was just rotating heels that they would manage, and they would go against either Bruno or Bob Backlund, and they would go through this cycle of heels, and they would, every heel had to have one of those three managers.
Yeah, that was just their formula back then, and they did not vary from the formula.
No, they were very formulaic in everything they did back in those days, from the format to the programs at the arenas. I mean, everything was, when I say programs, I don't mean a physical program. I mean, the heel challenger would usually beat Bruno or Backlund by count out the first month. Yeah. And then they bring it back the second month. And if the guy was really over, it would be some kind of other false finish or non-finish. And then the third time would be a cage match, or whatever the blow-off match would be. It was always the same thing. But yeah, it was funny. Like, some of those great talkers didn't need managers. And I think in the case of Billy Graham, he really didn't need the Wizard, because the Wizard was the one manager who never interfered. He was a small guy. I never saw him ever lay a hand on a wrestler. Whereas
he actually, he took pride in that, actually.
Yes.
When I interviewed him about that. And there was a fourth match, if you recall, to the formula. The first three, as you described, and the fourth match was after that heel lost cleanly to Bruno in the blow-off match. He then appeared in the semi-wind-up match against another babyface on the next card, and would do a job for that babyface and then leave the territory.
Yep, that's exactly how it went. And he was gone, and it was time for by that point, the new round of heels had come in and started getting their squash match wins on TV. I was going to say, though, the thing with Heenan, the way he was different than the Wizard is, obviously Bobby Heenan, one of the great bump-taking managers of all time, was not shy about getting involved in Nick's matches. So I do think when you look back on it, it really was a great pairing. No, Nick didn't need a mouthpiece, but Heenan definitely added a lot, I think, to his heat, as you said, and it did draw money.
He did. He took bumps, and he juiced constantly.
Absolutely. Well, you made a good point, too, about Nick not looking really the part. And I always thought that, too. Again, just as a kid looking at the magazines, I didn't have AWA television. But, you know, you would see these guys. I mean, obviously I grew up again on Bruno and Superstar. And I saw a lot of, you know, in other territories, what heels look like. And then I saw these pictures of Nick Bockwinkel, and I'm like, that's the champion, because he looked like the least threatening, you know, person you could ever see. And he did look he did not look like he should have been a professional wrestler.
Well, it's funny that you say that. He might not have on TV, but if you were in a room with Nick, and I think part of it was that wrestlers in that era were so much larger physically than so many of the wrestlers today. Nick Bockwinkel in person was 230 pounds, probably about 6'2", and certainly looked like a professional athlete. And in the ring, of course, his work was as smooth and as believable as anybody in the business at that time.
Absolutely. And then as I got older and got access to seeing, you know, some of Nick's work, yeah, clearly he was a fantastic worker. And I understood as I got older why Nick was the champion for so long. And his first reign, when he beat Vern, he held the title for 5 years. Did you ever hear the story? I don't know if you have or not, but I mean, Vern was on top for a long time. Did you ever understand or get the story as to why he chose Nick to be kind of his successor and to let Nick have that 5-year run with the title?
I've heard different stories. One of them was that Nick was 35 years old by the time he entered the AWA. He'd wrestled in a lot of territories. He was, of course, a second-generation wrestler. And I believe Vern had designs on him taking the title as being kind of the heir apparent. Of course, that wasn't decided for sure until he saw how Nick would get over in the AWA. But I believe that from the very start, he thought that Nick would be someone who could be the next champion. If you recall, Vern was very, very big on people who were believable characters, good athletes, good workers in the ring. And Nick, you know, checked all those boxes. And also, Nick was so good on the mic that his interviews would really help draw money.
You mentioned earlier the tag team of Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. And I think it was last week's show, we talked about Ray a little bit and talked about what a wild man he was and a thrill seeker outside the ring, which sounds like quite a contrast to Nick Bockwinkel's personality. I'm wondering how the two of them, obviously they were magic in the ring, how they coexisted outside the ring. Because this is back in the day when tag teams would travel on the road together, spend a lot of time together. Did you ever hear anything about how the two of them got along with such different personalities?
I believe they got along very well. Nick was the kind of guy who really could get along with most people because he was open-minded, non-judgmental, and was just, you know, not one to kind of alienate, you know, others in the business. I believe he and Ray got along well. They shared a love of boating. They each had boats. They used to spend their off days, you know, going off and fishing and going off in there, you know, spending time on the lake. Nick would always kind of snicker about Ray just because Ray would say these crazy things and oftentimes do these crazy things. And Nick, one of Nick's favorite phrases was "God love him." So he would look at Ray sometimes doing something nutty and say, Ray, God love him. But it was a term of endearment by Nick, and I think they got along quite well.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm just picturing Ray, you know, chasing women and, you know, cigar hanging out of his mouth and, I don't know, drinking and I don't know, playing poker. These are all the things I picture with Ray Stevens. And I picture Nick kind of, I don't know, reading a book in his hotel room. That seems like the Nick.
Nick had his fun times, but yes, when it came to lifestyle, he was far more conservative than Ray. When I first met Nick, he had been divorced and he had been dating a former Northwest Airlines stewardess, Darlene. who became his wife, and they were married for a long time. You know, she was his widow, a really beautiful, lovely, classy woman. And yes, his like I say, his lifestyle was different than Ray's.
So tell me a little bit more about your initial meeting with Nick. You mentioned that you were kind of hanging around, trying to get noticed, trying to break into the business. I think you had mentioned that you had promoted some spot shows. I mean, you were still in high school, but you're trying to break in to have a greater role in the business. You have this idea for the yearbooks, and Nick is the guy who was sort of the conduit to Vern to get the wheels in motion. How was it that you first made that contact with Nick? Did you just go up to him, introduce yourself, tell him you had this idea? Was he receptive right away? Because again, Nick is a heel at this point, and in public, he's not really supposed to be nice to anyone. So what was that awkward? What was it like?
It was basically as you described. I was pretty fearless in those days. If I got turned down by a wrestler, I got turned down. But I recall that when I approached Nick, Nick always carried himself in a very classy way outside the ring, whether he was a heel or not. One of Nick's goals, I believe, was to present professional wrestling and himself as a professional wrestler as a classy person, not as what they used to call a grunter and a growler. Groaner rather. It's not someone who was outlandish when he was outside the ring or when he was just as a citizen, so to speak. Nick was someone who read constantly. He was always carrying, say, a Time magazine, which was a big weekly news magazine at the time, or a newspaper. He was always up on current events. And he just, that's just the way he was. So when I approached Nick, he was, very dignified, very nice, listened to what I had in mind, thought it was a good idea. And we developed a friendship.
And then from there, you become a promoter. And I know when you were promoting in Baltimore, you did promote some AWA shows. And you got to Nick came in and worked those shows. I'm pretty sure Nick worked some of those shows in Baltimore, didn't he?
He did. He worked just a few. It was during that brief period, as we've talked about before, when I had basically 3 matches coming in from Jim Crockett Promotions and 3 matches coming in from the Minneapolis office, the AWA office. And so Nick did appear a few times. I'll tell you one of my favorite memories of Nick, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this before, but I was doing some spot shows for Pro Wrestling USA, and we had a spot show up in Utica, New York. And at that time, the State Athletic Commission in New York would assign the referees. We could request referees that they would assign. But sometimes out in, small towns like Utica, they just sent whomever. We didn't bring referees with us. And they had a young guy there who had never refereed before and was not smart to the business. And Nick was acting as the agent, and Nick was not about to smart this kid up. And he came over. I introduced him to Nick. I said, Nick is the guy who's kind of the agent for the wrestlers. And Nick looked at the guy and said, "Have you ever refereed before?" And he said, "No." And Nick said, "Well, just go in the ring and call it as you see it." And that was the end of the discussion.
I'm just trying to imagine what that was like, having a referee who wasn't smart to what was going on. Do you think he figured it out as the match was going on, or no?
I don't know, but it was a clean finish. And when someone's shoulders were pinned to the mat, the referee counted 1, 2, 3, and that was over. And the match was over, and the referee would raise the victor's hand as the winner, and it was on to the next match.
Wow. Yeah, I remember Nick had a run. I think it was brief, but around 1994, he was the on-screen WCW commissioner. So again, you got to work with Nick in WCW. It's interesting that here's the guy who, sort of brought you in and mentored you, and then he got to see you become a success. Did you guys ever talk about, once you made it as a promoter and then made it onto WCW, did you and Nick ever talk about, hey, remember when I was a kid and you broke me in?
Nick would bring that up constantly. I think he took it as a great source of pride. I mean, obviously, we were fond of one another. I think he was proud of what I had done and what I had become, from this 15, 16-year-old kid who loved wrestling to becoming an actual promoter. So yes, he would talk about it and smile, and like I say, I think it brought him a lot of joy that he was able to kind of be the person that started me out, so to speak.
Yeah, I would think so. I think anytime you take a chance on someone and then they go on and do great things, that, yeah, obviously you would take a source of pride that you saw something, he saw something in you that you could be you could benefit the AWA back then. And that, you had designs on a career, and then you made it happen, and he played a role in it. So I could understand why he would, take pride in that.
Yeah, and I also got to be friendly with members of his family. I don't know if you recall, he had a brother, Dennis. Dennis died very young. He had a lot of drug issues. But Dennis was in the AWA as a referee under the name Dennis O'Brien.
Okay.
And I got to know Dennis fairly well. And then I was on a trip when I was very young. This is before I was a promoter. I was probably just, 19 or 20. And I took a trip out to California, just a pleasure trip. And I had the opportunity to meet another brother. And these were half brothers. Nick's parents had been divorced, and his father had remarried. And Dennis was a half brother, and he has another half brother, Bob. And I called Bob when I was in California, and I wanted to meet him. And he invited me to dinner at his parents' home. And I got to go have dinner at the home of Warren Bockwinkel and his wife and Bob. And that was a great thrill for me at the time, having dinner at Warren Bockwinkel's home.
See, this is why you make old school cool, Gary. Now last week we found out you had dinner with Ole Anderson at his home. Now Nick Bockwinkel. I mean, these are fascinating stories. The people that you've gotten to break bread with.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun for me, because Warren Bockwinkel was he was never really a main eventer in his day. He was kind of known in St. Louis as Lou Thesz's policeman. If you wanted to get a shot at Lou Thesz's world championship, you had to go through Warren Bockwinkel in the semi-wind-up match on another card. So he was often that stepping stone to a match with the champion.
Do you recall at I think it was called Slamboree, the WCW show, in the early 90s, Nick came out of retirement and wrestled Dory Funk Jr. Do you recall?
Yes, I remember it well. It was at the Omni in Atlanta.
I don't remember that match. Do you have memories of it? I mean, obviously neither one of these guys were in their prime at that point. But from what I recall, I don't remember ever hearing that it was not a good match. I mean, what do you recall?
I don't have a great recollection of it. I did watch it. I think it was a 15-minute Broadway, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was a draw.
Yeah, obviously these were guys who were, as you suggest, well past their prime, but still able to work, I think, a respectable match, all things considered. And if you recall, those were two of the greatest workers of their era.
For sure. And they had to be, if they weren't in their late 50s, they were certainly maybe 60 at that point. So did you get a chance to, do you remember at all talking to Nick about that match? Was he at all concerned about if he could still do it inside the ring, or was he confident that he could pull it off? If you had that conversation.
We did not have that conversation, so I really don't have a comment on that.
Okay. All right. Well, Gary, these are awesome Nick Bockwinkel stories. I got to learn a lot. Again, not being a fan And when I say not a fan, I mean not someone who grew up in the area. I didn't know much about, the real Vern Gagne and the real Nick Bockwinkel. So that's why I enjoy these stories. Did one of your best stories, which you told when we talked about Vern, is just how Nick didn't break kayfabe when you first approached him about the idea of the yearbooks, and he told you that Vern has a lot of influence because he's the champion, not smartening you up that Vern was the owner of the territory. I always thought that was funny. Did you get any sense of what Nick and Vern, what their relationship was like? I know that you said Vern obviously had a lot of respect for Nick. That's why he brought him in. That's why he groomed him and eventually put the championship on him. But as we talked about once before, when Nick lost the title in 1980, it was to Vern, who was well past his prime. And then he went on to hold it for a while and then retired without dropping the strap back to Nick, who was then handed the title by the, I guess, the AWA commissioner. What was it? Was his name? Was that Wally Carbo, or I'm not sure.
It was
Stanley Blackburn.
Stanley Blackburn, I believe, was a funeral director from Amarillo, Texas, and had promoted some shows down there. And how he got to be this figurehead president of the AWA, I've never known.
Wow.
But he was. And they would bring him in about once a year to showcase him. And around the same time that they'd bring Joe Blanchard in to be the troubleshooting referee. And as I later learned, this happened in the summer, this was to coincide with Vern's annual fishing trip up north, where all these guys would go on a fishing trip. So they'd come in early and get a payday working one of the shows.
Oh, that's outstanding. That's outstanding. Did you ever get a sense, though, that Nick was, I don't know if upset's the right word, but just, did Vern really need to have one last run? Did Vern really need to retire without dropping the title? Did you and Nick ever discuss that, or Nick ever give you any indication of what his feelings were about it?
We never discussed it, but I knew Nick well enough to know that Nick was all business, and Nick had a hell of a run in the AWA. He made good money. He always worked on the top of the card, after a certain point. He and Vern had a very respectful business relationship. I don't know that their families and their wives ever socialized together, but I do know that they had, as I say, a very productive business relationship. And I don't think Nick was the kind of guy to argue a finish, to object, to in any way be bitter about a finish. Nick was the featured, the top featured heel for all those years, made a great living, had a lifestyle that he liked. And I don't think the issues with Vern over the belt really mattered one way or the other.
Well, that's consistent with the way you've described Nick as being all class and certainly being all business. I just would wonder, I would think a normal person, though, and Nick was human for sure, would have to, I don't know, maybe roll his eyes to some extent when Vern's like, yeah, I'm going to win the title at age whatever he was, and I'm not going to lose it. But I'll hand it back but the promoter will, the commissioner will just hand it back to you. I could see anyone would probably roll their eyes a little bit in that instance, even if he didn't,
I rolled my eyes because I thought, why not have some kind of a tournament or something to determine the new champion as opposed to just handing someone the belt. But,
right.
It's professional wrestling, and whoever owned the territory was going to decide how it was done, and that was Vern, and that was it.
That's right. The winners make the rules, and the owners make the rules. And when you're the owner and you want to make yourself the champion, even when you're, well past your prime, and then not lose it, you can do that. So, and Vern did.
And I think one of the reasons that Nick was so successful in working for Vern and in the AWA was that Nick was the consummate professional and a good soldier, and was not one to cause any trouble.
Right, and certainly dependable. We talked last week about maybe why did certain this guy or that guy not get a run with the championship, and maybe it was some guys led wild lifestyles or whatever. And certainly Nick, like, there's a guy, if you're a promoter and you're going to make a guy your champion, a guy that you're going to invest in. Everything you've said about Nick makes him sound like a promoter's a dream. He's great in the ring. He's great on the mic. He's a smart guy, and he's dependable. And you couldn't ask for much more than that. I think that checks off all the boxes.
No question. I think without a doubt, he was one of the greatest performers of his era.
Do you think Nick, since you bring that up, do you think Nick maybe doesn't get, isn't remembered quite as fondly? When people talk about the greatest of all time, you don't often hear Nick's name mentioned, but you probably should. I mean, when you consider what he did in the AWA, how long he was on top, what he did in the territories before that, Nick's probably, you got to put him in the, I don't know, top 20 or 25 of all time, I would think. He's got the resume for it.
I put him really way higher than that. I'd put him in the top 10.
Wow.
He didn't get some of the recognition he deserved because he was in the AWA.
Right.
And if, the NWA champion got way more publicity in the magazines. The New York market, the WWF, was so much bigger in terms of population, with New York and Boston and Philadelphia and DC, that Bruno and even others there would be on the cover of the national magazines far more than anybody from the AWA. Definitely. So I just think it's almost kind of like baseball, whereas you'll have some players who don't play in the big markets and they don't get the recognition that some of the others get. Mookie Betts gets way more press than Mike Trout, for example, because he plays on a winning team. So I think it was just kind of the times and the way wrestling was covered and the various kind of geographical boundaries that existed back then. But I would definitely put Nick, in that top tier.
I want to squeeze in one question before we wrap up for today. This comes from Nina on Twitter, and she says, she must know you, Gary, because she says, you have memorabilia dating back to the 80s. Do you have any plans to go through it all and eventually show it off?
Oh, that's a good question. I do have quite a plethora of memorabilia, and I don't know if I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what vehicle I would use. I certainly don't plan, at least at this point, on selling any of it. I hope I'm never in a financial predicament where I have to sell any of it. But I have stuff that has great sentimental value to me, and I would love to display it at some point. If there's a proper vehicle to do so. But yes, I think I know who that questioner is. Okay. She's a big fan and a great friend, and has seen some of the memorabilia, and I appreciate her asking.
I was going to say, if someone knows that you have this memorabilia, because I've never seen you show off anything anywhere, that she must know you to some extent. So that makes sense. Let me ask you.
Next time you're in Atlanta, Kevin, I will be happy to give you a tour and show you some of the more interesting and unseen memorabilia, unseen by most, memorabilia.
That I would love to do that next time. I don't know that I'll be getting on a plane anytime soon, but certainly when things open up and Ring of Honor is back at center stage, I would love to make that trip and see what you have. Do you have it displayed? Are you the type who has it displayed in your man cave or somewhere in your house? Or if you're like me, all of my memorabilia are in boxes and they're in my garage. Like, I don't have anything displayed.
It is both ways here.
Okay.
I have some displayed in my home. I have boxes and boxes of it in my attic. So yeah, it's kind of a combination of both.
So if I had to put you on the spot and say, what if you could only pick one thing, what would you say is your most prized possession of all the memorabilia that you own?
Oh boy, I don't know that I could narrow it down to one. I'm a big collector of folk art, and folk art is art by untrained artists. And I didn't become aware of it until I moved to Atlanta. And I went to a folk art show many years ago, and there was a picture of a WCW event, and it was very expensive, and I didn't buy it right there. And it ended up not being purchased. It went back to the gallery. It was a gallery in North Carolina. And I later decided I was going to buy it. So I called the woman who owned the gallery, and she said, "You're a week late. We just sold it to someone," as I'll never forget it. She said, "We sold it to someone from Amsterdam, Netherlands." And I was rather distraught. So what I thought I would do, the artist was a developmentally disabled adult, as many folk artists are. His name was Brooks Yeomans, and he lived in North Carolina, not far from Winston-Salem. So I gave Brooks, through, I guess, one of his people that took care of him, some tickets to go to our show in Winston-Salem, and I asked him if he would paint me another picture, which he did, and I purchased that picture, and it is proudly displayed on my wall.
Wow, that is another great story. I would love to see at some point. We definitely have to make this happen where I can see your memorabilia. I'm sure you have some very cool pieces. That was a great question from Nina. And, we've said here on Old School in Session, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. We've asked a couple here and there, but we're going to have a show next week, Gary, if you're willing, where we'll really focus it on the questions. We have a little bit of a backlog of questions, but if anybody else out there has a question they would like to ask Gary, you can use the hashtag #AskGary on Twitter, and maybe we will ask it next week. That is all the time we have for today, though. So I want to thank everybody for listening. As a reminder, a new episode of Old School in Session drops every Wednesday right here on Ring of Honor's YouTube channel. Once again, if you have a question for Gary, it's #AskGary on Twitter. For Gary Juster, this is Kevin Eck, and Old School is out. Until next week.
Are you watching the show that's thrilling critics and fans? ROH Pure. The reviews are in. It's completely different than anything else in pro wrestling. I enjoyed every minute of this show. ROH Pure delivers. Valiant Saint raves. Take my money. This was awesome. Join our ROH stars for the #ROH Pure watch party every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific.